the PM 2.5 to 10 particles, the bigger particles, impact on the upper airways, whereas the smaller particles can get deep down into the lung, into the lower airways. And so there's the potential to have a different range of health effects associated with that. And when people think of particles, think of air pollution, they think of respiratory effects, as you would. But this is a rather complex slide to illustrate that once pollutants get into the airways, they can come in contact with the cardiovascular system, with the blood, and get distributed around the body, and so you can get cardiovascular effects as well. That was a real surprise for people, that it's not only respiratory, it's cardiovascular, heart disease, artery disease. So, in summary, the health effects of particles related to short-term exposures, that's exposures that go up and down on a daily basis, are lung inflammation, respiratory symptoms, adverse effects on the cardiovascular system, increased medication use, increased hospital admissions, and increased mortality. Many studies around the world have looked at particular locations and particular concentrations of particles and found these results. With increased particle pollution, increases in these things. But particle pollution, as well as short-term effects, has longer-term effects. So that 1993 study, the City study, the slide that didn't turn out, looked at annual average air pollution, cities with generally higher levels of exposure over long time periods. Different to daily fluctuations, those longer-term exposures can also produce reductions in lung function, increased symptoms, increased COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and can also lead to reductions in life expectancy, mainly due to cardiopulmonary mortality and lung cancer. Now, you'll often hear people say particles are associated with mortality, so there's increased mortality. That's true, but there's a twist to it. No one's life is saved because of reducing air pollution. People can live longer if air pollution is reduced, but everyone dies. Okay? So the issue is not so much the difference in the rate of death, but how much longer or how much your life is reduced because of air pollution exposures. And studies have identified these people as being particularly susceptible to the effects of particulate pollution. Children and the elderly, people with pre-existing disease, some genetic predispositions, and people in low socioeconomic status areas. Now, there's a heap of research that shows those things are associated with air pollution. But science often takes a weighted evidence approach to think, well, which of those studies, which of those things are we really convinced by, and which are we not certain about? And this study looks at the weighted evidence from not likely to inadequate to suggestive. These particles may affect these outcomes, to causal. So we're very certain that exposure to particles do affect these health outcomes. And causally associated is mortality, cardiovascular morbidity, respiratory morbidity is likely, and these effects are suggestive. Okay? Okay? The jury's still out on these ones. For short-term exposures, these are the health outcomes that have been causally related to particulate air pollution. Mortality, cardiovascular morbidity, respiratory is likely. Inadequate is some recent effects on the central nervous system that have been demonstrated. But studies have shown this. So what are the sources of PM, of particles, particulates, PM, all the same, jargon for the same thing, particles, small particles in the air. Well, for PM10, in the greater metropolitan region of Sydney, including the Lower Hunter and the Illawarra, industry contributes about 60%. Vehicles, about a bit over 20%. And these are the other sources, main sources of particle pollution. Sorry, I just locked up. So the rest of the presentation is going to quickly breeze through, hopefully not too much of a rush, the other pollutants that we're mainly interested in, the common air pollutants, that's particles, sulphur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, and lead. The common air pollutants, because there's generally a lot of them around and we can measure them. But also talk about air toxics, a group of chemicals that we have less information on, that the concentrations are much lower, but can have important, very severe health effects. Okay, so I'm going to skip over a few slides pretty quickly here, so please excuse me if I jump over just to keep on time. Here's some trends in PM2.5, fine particles in Sydney, the Illawarra and the Lower Hunter. And you can see the standard for PM2.5 is 8 microgram per metre cubed. And there are years when it goes up, but we're generally, in these regions, around 6 to 8 microgram per metre cubed. So that's the standard. Now, standards in air pollution, especially for particulates, can sometimes give people a false sense of security. Because often they make you think, well, above the standard bad, below the standard good. But what we've found with particulate pollution is that there's a linear dose-response relationship. So even low levels of air pollution, of particulate pollution, are associated with small increases in adverse health effects. And the magnitude of the effect is just related to the magnitude of the air pollution exposure. There doesn't appear to be a threshold. Here's PM10. The concentrations are high. This is maximum PM10, but often particulates can come from unexpected sources like dust storms, bushfires, and there's really not a lot of control we can have over those, but those exposures can be huge on some days. And here's average PM10. So average PM10 is below the standard. Remember what I said about standards? And this is cutting out those big unexpected days. So we're around 30 before. Oh, sorry, 20 before. Okay, sulphur dioxide. Sulphur dioxide often is thought of with particles because they're often, especially in North America, together. You find high concentrations of sulphur dioxide with high concentrations of particles. But sulphur dioxide has slightly different effects. Short-term effects, or effects on lung function, especially in asthmatics, increased hospitalisations, increased mortality. Long-term exposure, probable reductions in life expectancy. And the sources, combustions and fossil fuels. Sulphur dioxide concentrations, this is generally low, but there will be some higher concentrations around sources. But this is in general. Nitrogen dioxide, a pollutant that really is a combustion product. Where you've got combustion, you've got nitrogen dioxide. The short-term effects are listed there, effects on lung function, increased allergic inflammatory reactions, increased hospitalisations, increased mortality, and there's also a suggestion of some long-term effects, including reductions in lung function and increased probability of respiratory symptoms. Another pollutant you'll hear about, nitrogen dioxide concentrations have decreased and are generally below the standard and range in that area in Sydney, Hunter and Illawarra. Another air pollutant you'll hear about is ozone. Ozone is not emitted from anything. It's cooked up in the atmosphere from other pollutants, nitrogen dioxide and this other group of pollutants called volatile organic compounds. In the presence of sunlight, make ozone. But it's a regional pollutant. It can get transported around over large distances. Ozone has a range of short-term health effects, lung effects, effects on the respiratory system, medication, hospitalisation, mortality, and long-term exposures. It can also cause reductions in lung function. And here's the sources of ozone. Well, it's the sources of ozone, because ozone's cooked up from nitrogen dioxide and volatile organic compounds. We'll talk about in a minute when we get time. So nitrogen dioxide, mainly from industry in the greater metropolitan area. If you went to Sydney, that would be mainly from motor vehicles. And volatile organic compounds have these sources. Off-road mobile sources, on-road, off-road sources of motor vehicles. And ozone concentrations in Sydney can be above the standard. But you can see here in the Illawarra and the Lower Hunter, it's generally lower. Because ozone's cooked up in Sydney, and my understanding is predominantly it heads down south. Now, lead is another common pollutant and has a whole range of very specific health effects. It's absorbed by the gastrointestinal tract via ingestion of food or objects containing lead. It's stored in bone, can reduce neurological function in children, and is phytotoxic. The sources of lead, primarily lead in petrol, smelters and battery factories. Now, lead is one of our success stories, in that lead was a much bigger problem in general than it is now. Lead has been reducing steadily since the introduction of unleaded petrol. And in general, we don't have any major concerns about lead in the ambient atmosphere apart from around contaminated sources, which can include home renovations of leaded paint. I'm going to show that one. Mercury is another pollutant of concern. Examples of toxic metals include arsenic, cadmium and other pollutants. Inorganic mercury is emitted from power stations, and in the air, in the atmosphere, that can be chemically transformed to methyl mercury, a different type of mercury, which is highly toxic and can bioaccumulate. And there have been very serious episodes of mercury poisoning from eating contaminated fish for long periods. And some authorities in levels of high mercury contamination that have been detected in fish will issue temporary and sometimes longer term warnings to restrict fishing. And there's another class of air pollutants that I'm not going to talk too much more detail about, I'm going to finish pretty soon, called air toxics. These are a diverse range of toxic chemicals. They're typically low concentrations. They're often from point sources, industry and other facilities, and diffuse sources. And there's increasing regulatory concern about these air toxics, but there's generally very little information about exposures. And there's groups of air toxics called volatile organic compounds, formaldehyde and benzene, and persistent organic pollutants that include DDT, dioxins and furanes. Craig, should I wrap it up now? Yeah. Okay. So there's much more information about dioxins you can find out. I'm happy to talk to other people about this afterwards. If I can just finish with these. Here's global exposure to PM2.5 in 2005, global exposure around the world. So in the scheme of things, air pollution exposure to PM2.5 in Australia is relatively low compared to other higher cities, but we're similar to other developed countries. This is a recent study that ranked various exposures, various risk factors for health globally. And globally, air pollution came in as number 9 as a risk factor for health among high blood pressure, tobacco, alcohol, a whole range of other ones. In Australia, Australasia, it was 26 compared to others. So, compared to globally, our air pollution issues aren't as important. That doesn't mean they're not important in some particular location.